At 7 a.m. on Tuesday, September 2nd, 2003, the quiet town of Bellevue, Idaho, was awakened by the sounds of gunshots. Shortly thereafter, the blaring of sirens filled the valley as officers from the Blaine County Sheriff's Office rushed to the home of Diane and Alan Johnson. Inside, they found a bloody scene. Diane was lying on the bed with a gunshot wound to her head, while Alan lay on the floor beside her, dead from a gunshot wound to his chest. Their 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, was unharmed, but in a hysterical state. As detectives worked to gather evidence, they uncovered astonishing secrets that led to a shocking revelation. Who could have made an enemy of Diane and Alan, and what led to their tragic deaths? Bellevue, Idaho, is a small, quiet town with a population of just over 2,000 people, located in Blaine County. Known for its fertile soil, potato farming, livestock, gemstones, and pristine natural landscapes, the town was established in 1882. It was a rugged western mining community that thrived off silver, gold, and lead, with a mine value of $60 million. Bellevue offers its residents suburban comforts mixed with rural tranquility, and the crime rate is generally lower than the national average in the United States. This is why the deaths of Diane and Alan Johnson in 2003 shocked the peaceful community to its core. On September 2, 2003, the Blaine County Sheriff's Department received a concerning emergency call from Kim Richards. 2 gunshots were reportedly heard. Where did the shots come from? The daughter came here and said that someone shot her parents, Kim explained. With urgency, 16-year-old Sarah Johnson ran to her neighbor's house, shouting that her parents, 52-year-old Diane and 46-year-old Alan Scott Johnson, had been killed. Officers and paramedics were dispatched to the scene immediately. Upon arrival, law enforcement officials entered the home and were met with a horrific sight. Diane had a gunshot wound to her head and appeared to have been killed while sleeping. The bed and ceiling near the head of the bed were covered in blood, and a piece of her skull lay on the floor next to the bed. Alan's body was there too, and he was wearing only a bottom garment with blood pooling beneath him. Initially, investigators thought the case was clear and closed, appearing to be a murder-suicide. But upon closer examination of the crime scene, their perspective quickly shifted. The detectives heard a running water sound and traced the blood to the adjoining bathroom, where the shower was running. When officers turned off the water, they noticed blood splatters and a distinct bullet hole on the wall of the shower. As investigators searched the house for more evidence, they found what they believed to be the murder weapon, a .264 Winchester rifle. At the foot of the bed where Diane lay, there was a kitchen knife, and another knife was found on their daughter's bed. The evidence found at the crime scene puzzled the investigators, presenting a mystery. There were no signs of forced entry, noting that the Johnsons rarely locked their doors, a fact known only to those close to the family. The house hadn't been ransacked, as one might expect from a burglary. Officers at the scene questioned Sarah about her recollections before she rushed to the neighbors for help. Sarah described how she was asleep when she heard the gashed into her parents' bedroom, screamed for her mother, and then heard a second shot. Without hesitation, she ran to the neighbors for help and did not see the attacker. Confirmed by the neighbor who called 911, nearby was a rental home for a close friend of Alan's, Mil Spag, aged 45. Investigators entered the property and found a significant piece of evidence on the bed: binoculars belonging to the same rifle found at the crime scene. But Mil was not there, making his absence a person of interest to investigators. The property was secured, and the lead investigator, Sergeant Althoff, ordered officers to stop a trash truck from picking up any waste containers from the property. Someone yelled for one of his deputies to run over and stop it, as the garbage truck was just about a house away and nearly took away crucial evidence. The ongoing theory was that Mil might have gotten into an argument with Alan and Diane, killing them in a moment of rage. While developing this theory, the crime scene unit searched the garbage containers and found more evidence inside: a pink bathrobe that had been discarded. Upon inspecting the crime scene, detectives found a latex glove and a brown leather glove that matched those found in the Johnsons' bedroom, along with .25 caliber ammunition. All evidence was marked and sent for DNA analysis. As investigators formulated their own scenarios, it became clear that the killer who committed the crime was aware of the unlocked doors, and the day trash was collected. It was likely the killer had thrown evidence in the trash before fleeing the scene. It was time to summon Mil Spag. Hours after the double murder, law enforcement learned that Mil had been located in Boise, Idaho. Mil agreed to speak with investigators and meet them at the Boise police station. When questioned about his whereabouts that morning, Mil stated he spent the weekend with his family and planned to return to Boise within the week. Investigators contacted Mil's family members, who confirmed he was with them. When Mil was asked about his relationship with Alan and Diane, he told officers that he had been renting the guest house from the couple for years and had a close and good relationship with them. When asked about the gun used in the murders, Mil admitted it was his, but claimed it was locked in his closet before he left for Boise for the weekend. The detectives then inquired whether he knew anyone who might have enemies with the couple, revealing that Alan and Diane had become increasingly concerned about their daughter Sarah, who began dating a 19-year-old named Bruno Santos. From what Mil had heard, Bruno was living in the country illegally and selling drugs to make a living. Mil emphasized that he believed they should look into Bruno Santos. This became an intriguing lead for investigators, who proceeded to speak with other family members and created a clearer picture of the Johnson family. Alan and Diane met in the early 80s when Diane was in a relationship, having a young son named Matt. The couple married in 1993 and adopted Matt as their own. They moved to a lovely home in Bellevue, Idaho, and in 1987 welcomed their daughter, Sarah Marie Johnson, into the world. On January 1, 1987, Alan was part owner of a landscaping company in Bellevue, and Diane worked as a tax preparer. Together, they built a beautiful home for their children and were widely regarded as a loving family. Alan was an avid shooter, and Diane loved to cook, frequently creating wonderful dishes in the kitchen. The couple was well known in their community, and by 2003, their family life appeared harmonious to outsiders. Matt was in his early 20s, attending the University of Idaho, while Sarah was doing well in school and was part of her volleyball team. However, investigators were about to uncover family tensions that had begun to surface in the months leading up to the murders. After excluding Mil as a potential suspect, the investigators took his advice and returned to Bellevue to talk with family members. As expected, everyone knew the Johnsons as a happy and loving family. Investigators interviewed their son Matt, who had returned from college, as well as Diane's sister and her husband, Linda and Jim Pfaff. The three agreed that family life seemed happy and normal until Sarah met Bruno Santos. Matt, Linda, and Jim all noted that Sarah's relationship with Bruno had become a major source of conflict within the family. In the months leading up to the murders, tensions escalated. As a teenager, Sarah was naturally rebelling against her parents' rules, and even when her parents forbade her from seeing Bruno again, she continued to defy them. Diane recounted being in the kitchen when she asked Sarah if she was in love with Bruno. Sarah replied that she thought they loved each other, and Diane said, "If they think they love each other, you won't be able to keep them apart." Meanwhile, Jim disclosed to investigators some information that might provide Bruno with a motive to kill Diane and Alan. Days before the murders, Alan and Diane discovered that Sarah had lied about spending the night at her friend's house when she was, in fact, with Bruno. Alan called Jim to inform him of what occurred and asked him to accompany them to confront Bruno. Jim shared with investigators that Alan was angry and threatened to report Bruno to the police for the alleged abuse of Sarah. Since Sarah was a minor, charges like these could lead to Bruno's deportation. After hearing what Jim revealed, investigators believed this was enough motivation for Bruno to eliminate the Johnson family. It was time to speak with Bruno Santos. The police were aware of Bruno, as he had a history of dropping out of high school and involvement in minor drug-related crimes. During the interview, Bruno became confrontational with the investigators. He was described as arrogant and difficult to deal with, asserting that he had proposed to Sarah and that she had accepted. Investigators deemed him to be an uncooperative and challenging interviewee. He conveyed to officers that they could contact his mother, who confirmed that he had been home with her sleeping on the couch that morning. For investigators, this was not strong evidence. When asked about Alan and Diane, it was clear that Bruno held negative feelings towards the Johnsons. Their initial thought was that Bruno was angry with Diane and Alan and decided to eliminate them so that he and Sarah could continue their relationship without hindrances. Meanwhile, crime scene units continued gathering evidence from around the home, searching every part for blood evidence that could indicate the assailant's escape route. In Sarah's room, they found blood splatters and bone fragments on the wall. These discoveries only deepened the mystery, and blood and bone samples were sent for testing. This led investigators to question whether Sarah's account of that morning was truthful. The search of her room produced more evidence. A single brown leather glove, the same kind found in the trash, along with a key to the guest house and unused .264 rounds. One of the unused bullets had a textile residue, likely transferred from the glove when the killer attempted to hide evidence. This evidence was also sent to the forensic lab for testing. Investigators now believed that Bruno might have killed Sarah's parents and enlisted her to help dispose of the evidence. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Bruno and his mother's home to collect evidence. They took Bruno's clothes, including his shoes, for testing, as well as his fingerprints for comparison with any found at the crime scene. Bruno was taken to the hospital, where a DNA sample was collected, along with hair samples and hand scrapes as evidence. Bruno was named the primary suspect in the murders of Alan and Diane Johnson. However, investigators were about to receive information that would send the investigation in a completely unexpected direction. Despite thoroughly examining Bruno's clothing and shoes, forensic experts failed to find any trace of Diane or Alan's blood at the actual crime scene. There were no traces of DNA, hair, or fingerprints in the vicinity of the Johnsons' bodies. Additionally, there was no physical evidence establishing Bruno's presence in the couple's bedroom. Tests on the gloves and bathrobe also resulted in negative findings for any of the Johnsons' DNA or blood. Investigators were baffled. They were sure that Bruno had the strongest motive for killing Alan and Diane. However, the lack of physical evidence suggesting Bruno's presence at the crime scene implied he might be telling the truth. In the end, Bruno was ruled out as a suspect in the case. As they reviewed the case closely, investigators began to consider another person of interest, Sarah Johnson. They rigorously questioned Sarah's family and friends about her home and personal life. They uncovered that Sarah had been prescribed antidepressants and that her relationship with her parents had been strained at best. Family members had dismissed her behaviors as typical teenage rebellion and did not consider them out of the ordinary for a girl her age. But Linda, Sarah's aunt, grew suspicious of her niece's behavior. Linda told investigators that Sarah wasn't processing her grief in a normal manner. She seemed more interested in returning to school and hanging out with friends than dealing with the loss of her parents, displaying no visible signs of distress. Something about Sarah's attitude struck investigators as unusual. Her friends all agreed that Sarah was acting nonchalant about the killings, appearing far more interested in her nails than her grieving process. What particularly raised eyebrows was Sarah's apparent preoccupation with Bruno after his arrest. It was strange to them that she was focused on her boyfriend rather than being angry about the supposed killer of her parents. Investigators found it hard to fathom, but they had no choice but to consider Sarah as a potential suspect, a 16-year-old girl capable of committing such a heinous act. The idea that a young girl could commit such a crime was perhaps the most difficult concept to grasp. The Johnson home remained an active crime scene, and investigators were now treating Sarah's room as a secondary area of interest. They were puzzled as to how blood spatter had made its way into her bedroom. A firearms expert was called to examine the spatter pattern more closely. After analyzing the direction from Alan and Diane's room to Sarah's, the expert concluded that both room doors were open at the time of the shooting. There was also evidence of blood on the hinge of Sarah's door that indicated it had been similarly opened during the incident. The detectives also called plumbers to the crime scene after reports of a blockage in one of the toilets. It became apparent that the source of the blockage was a bathrobe. Investigators conducted interviews with Linda, Matt, and Mil Spag about some evidence found. Matt and Linda confirmed that the pink bathrobe belonged to Sarah, and Mil verified that Sarah had a key to the guest house and frequently assisted them in cleaning it. He also informed investigators that Sarah was aware of the gun stored in the vault. Investigators now needed to link Sarah to all the evidence, but establishing that connection proved difficult since witnesses stated that Sarah displayed no signs of blood when she ran to the neighbors for help. Forensic experts confirmed this, employing a substance to test for any blood on Sarah's clothing, which yielded no findings. Authorities issued a warrant to retrieve and test the clothing Sarah wore that morning. At the same time, they wanted to talk to Sarah again and see if her story had changed since their last conversation. Investigators called Sarah in again for questioning, and she was staying with her aunt and uncle. Minor discrepancies in Sarah's account emerged, and investigators found that her story had changed at least 5 different times. In some versions, she claimed to have been asleep when she heard the gunshots. In others, she said she was awake when she heard the first shot. In yet another recount, she said she was still in her room when she heard the second shot, but then she altered her story again, stating she was outside her parents' room when the second shot was fired. She also struggled to recall if her parents' bedroom door was open or closed at the time of the shooting. Investigators remained calm during their interview with Sarah to prevent her from picking up on their suspicions. They already knew both doors were open, which was the only explanation for the blood spatter in Sarah's room. Investigators requested a DNA sample from Sarah, along with hair and hand samples, as part of the inquiry to clear her name. All these samples were sent for testing at the lab. The upper and lower portions of the pajamas Sarah wore the morning of the murders were sent to forensic specialist Rod Ingard for examination under a powerful microscope. Ingard found no traces of blood on the front of the top, but on the back, he discovered high-velocity blood spatter patterns that were described as tiny marks similar to pencil dots, many even smaller and layered on top of one another. He also found blue cotton fibers and green paint flecks on the fabric that matched a shirt Sarah was wearing that morning. But the most crucial moment had yet to come. Lab results also confirmed that Sarah's DNA was present on the inner lining of the rubber glove, and residues of lead were found on both pairs of the brown leather gloves. The bathrobe, gloves, and rubber glove were sent to a lab in Chicago, where lead residues were eventually found on all 3 items. The blood on the gloves and robe belonged to both Alan and Diane. This was more than enough for investigators to arrest Sarah and charge her with the murders of her parents. On October 9, 2003, Sarah Johnson was charged with the murder of her parents, Alan and Diane Johnson. She was held without bail in Blaine County Jail, awaiting trial. Police informed Sarah, "You have an arrest warrant for the murder of your parents, Diane and Alan Johnson." The story of the teenage girl who killed her parents became national headlines and generated media frenzy. Investigators and prosecutors had to develop a compelling argument showing that Sarah was motivated and capable of committing such a heinous crime, relying on statements from family members and friends of Sarah and her parents. They began building the convoluted narrative of an emotionally strained teen. Since Sarah had started dating Bruno and her parents disapproved, she had been sneaking around behind their backs, acting like any normal teenager would. However, a catalyst for Sarah occurred just days before the killings. She lied to her parents about staying with a friend when she was actually with Bruno. The threats her father made to report Bruno for assault and to have him deported to Mexico pushed Sarah to the brink. Investigators and prosecutors believed this was the moment Sarah formulated her plan to dispose of her parents and live happily with Bruno. Being a true crime and murder mystery aficionado, Sarah thought she had the perfect scheme. On the morning of the murders, she woke, went to the guest house to retrieve the rifle, donned latex gloves and leather gloves, and put on a bathrobe to avoid blood splatter on her hair. She then threw the shower curtain aside to prevent any blood from touching her clothing and headed to her parents' room. Upon hearing her father enter the bathroom, she shot Diane in the head while she was asleep, and then heard her father Alan calling out and opening the bathroom door before shooting him in the chest. After committing the crimes, she placed kitchen knives in the bedrooms to stage the scene as if an intruder had killed her parents, then gathered the evidence and tossed it into the trash, knowing that the waste company would collect the evidence before investigators could find it. But things did not go according to plan, and she failed to consider evidence that would be discovered in her room and the bathrobe that got caught in the plumbing system. The evidence against Sarah was overwhelming, and it was time for the trial to take place. In February 2005, 2 years after her parents' murder, 18-year-old Sarah Johnson went on trial for their killings. Her defense team argued that Sarah was innocent and that her parents had been killed by an intruder. Despite the prosecution being ready with its case, presenting material evidence found at the crime scene, and testimonies from family and friends that suggested Sarah's behavior was suspicious after her parents' murder, there were 3 individuals in the Johnson home that morning when Alan and Diane were killed, only one of whom remained alive, Sarah Marie Johnson. The most damning evidence was the testimony of Bruno Santos, who wanted not only to disassociate himself from the murders during the trial, but also presented evidence about Sarah's mental state before the murders. Bruno testified that he and Sarah had agreed to marry, and Sarah had told him they could live together in a big, lovely, happy home. He also indicated in court that Sarah frequently spoke about her hatred for her parents and expressed a desire to kill them. After 5 weeks of testimony, evidence, and explanations of the crime scene, the jury reached a verdict on March 16, 2005. They found 18-year-old Sarah Johnson guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Since then, Sarah has filed multiple appeals seeking to reduce her life sentence, but all have been denied, and she remains incarcerated. Following Sarah's conviction, surviving family members expressed their feelings publicly regarding Sarah and her actions. The deaths of Alan and Diane had completely shattered their family. Most feel that Sarah is to blame and deserves the punishment she received. Sarah's brother Matt stated that Sarah showed no remorse for killing their parents and said that if given a second chance, she would likely commit an even better murder to avoid capture. "My mom and dad treated you like family, and I don't understand why you threw that away. Among all the things I miss their warm hugs, and I want to see the maximum sentence for you. Because after tomorrow, when you read your sentence, I never want to hear about you or this incident again." Debbie Sheeman, Diane's mother, spoke to Sarah during her sentencing, stating that they still loved her, but that her actions had completely destroyed their family. "We are completely shattered by the deaths of your father and mother. The shock was worse when we realized who committed the crime." Lynn Murrell, Alan's sister, added that Sarah was spoiled and immature, capable of killing another person again if released, calling upon the judge to ensure she never gets paroled. This case was exceptionally complex and deeply disturbing. The capacity to kill one's parents showcases that Sarah Johnson only thought of herself and not the devastation she caused to her brother and family as they tried to piece their lives back together. Meanwhile, Sarah remains behind bars due to her unjustifiable crime. So today we ask, do you think Sarah is truly capable of feeling remorse? Do you believe Bruno helped in planning the crime with Sarah, only to betray her in the end to save himself?